going to start with a video clip. So that, oh, I don't want it to start again. There you go. I mean, it's great, but we need to do it once. That was an excerpt from the video My Bodies, 2014 work by the Berlin-based artist and writer Hannah Black. And as you can see, it features excerpts from pop songs by, among the ones I can recognize, Rihanna, Mariah Carey, and Ciara, who are all American female singers of color. And each excerpt just contains the word my body or some version of it. This video, or rather this portion of it, towards the end of the work, it becomes quite different. Draws, obviously, on the online format of the Supercut, which was defined as a fast-paced montage of short video clips that obsessively isolates a single element from its source, usually a word, phrase, or cliche from film and TV. That was the definition given, first definition given by the blogger Andy Baio in 2008. The Supercut generally tends to be celebratory or humorous. It's a product of fan culture. The effect of the repetition in Black's work is much more ambivalent. Despite each of the fragments being an assertion to ownership, it's a very multiplicity of these claims which begins to actually undo them. The net effect is less affirmative than a kind of unmooring of our sense of its subject. Whose body, we want to ask? Which body? What body? The disorientating sense of disconnect is enhanced by the fact that Black pictures on screen either these sort of abstract forms, which were repeated later in the video as a fragment of a cave, but also the images of middle-aged white men, which she revealed in an interview with AQNB, she found by just searching online for words like CEO and executive. What I find interesting about this work is the fact that in it, bodies seem to be everywhere and at the same time nowhere. They're both omnipresent and kind of unidentifiable. And we can apply that not just to the body of the work, but also, in fact, to the sort of sphere of cultural discussion that we're inhabiting today, where the body is a catchy buzzword from the worst view, and also a subject which it's quite hard to understand what's really at stake in when we discuss it. Perhaps you might argue this is the fate of all concepts, tropes, or shibboleths of art speak and theory, especially those with definite articles, such as the viewer or the political. As far as the body goes, Sally O'Reilly writes in the introduction to her survey, The Body in Contemporary Art, first published in 2009, that the body in contemporary art is a bewilderingly vast subject. There are as many bodies as there are artists and viewers, after all. In fact, it seems improbable that there is any art that does not involve the body, since making art and relating to it are rooted in the material world of encounter. If we take the mind to be the seat of intellect, the body is our interface with the world, and our senses its line of communication, so that even the most dematerialized conceptual work must take the body into account in some way. So in this way, she argues, even though she's trying to write a book specifically about the topic of the body, she admits even on the first page that the body is somehow everywhere, and she's on a sort of fool's errand by trying to isolate one strand of art. There's a similar sense of this condition of the body being simultaneously central and dispersed, omnipresent but sort of elusive. I think in quite a different work, which I'll show now. This is painting Eddie from 2016 by the London-based artist Celia Hampton. Now, I admit that at first glance, this does seem to be actually much more emphatic about the condition of being bodily or carnal. Its subject is quite obviously a representative part of the body. It is, as a friend skeptical of this part of the artist who've recently said to me over some drinks, just a big picture of a dick. He was implying, I think, that this painting was a kind of naive celebration of the nude, which is, of course, in the West tradition rooted in a very particular canon of art, in the sense of its own canon, the idea that the nude was somehow the pinnacle of the Western representative tradition. More specifically, from this perspective, even the supposed novelty of this work, which is the fact that in it it's a male body which is subject to a female gaze, which sort of reverses or inverts the expected coding of artist observer as male and model object as female. Many responses to this work have compared it to a sort of feminist inversion of Courbet's L'Origine du Monde in the dorset, which is similarly close cropped but of the female genitals. And in that sense, it performs a trick slightly similar to this experiment was made by Linda Nochlin in 1972. She bought the postcard on the left from a sort of semi-porn, she calls it, from a bookshop in Paris, and she wanted to find a male comparison and couldn't, so decided to make her own. And she originally was going to use frankfurters, and she was talking to Louise Bourgeois one day, and she said, oh, no, use bananas, it will work much better. So even if you do accept that reading of what Hempton's doing, this very sense of novelty or progress can be seen as actually resulting in something retrograde. I think to my friend's eyes, it's nevertheless a kind of reification of the phallus and the whole patriarchal order which is founded around it. Actually, as it happens, I'm a great admirer of Hempton's work, and I'm not going to get into a big detailed defense of it. But I think that it's worth admitting that there's a kind of counter-narrative here. In fact, even though it seems to be the whole thematic focus of the work, this choice of subject is quite incidental to Hempton's practice, at least in her own terms. As she explains it, she began painting male genitalia, as well as other erogenous zones or semi-erogenous zones, in an attempt to find an interesting position, in her words, from which to paint. Her paintings of male buttocks, for example, originated when she wanted to paint her own boyfriend with an erection, and he found that he couldn't maintain this other than watching pornography, which spoiled the sitting mode, so decided to flip him onto his back. What I'm looking for, she says, when painting, is a situation more important than the painting itself. So again, we have this condition in which the body seems to be absolutely central to what we're looking at, and at the same time isn't really there at all. While we're looking at a body, it's not really the subject of the artist's interest. If the supercut, or rather, if the internet, via the format of the supercut, was present in Hannah Black's video, the internet also can be read as shaping Hempton's practice. For her series Chat Random, she painted on screen from conversations she held with strangers across the world on her laptop, using the webcam site of the same name. I've got one here. Yeah. This one is entitled Russia, 12th of August, 2014, and the titles simply alludes to the location of the sitter and the time of the conversation. There's a pervading sense of the melancholy of such fleeting interactions, in some sense heavily networked, as in entirely relying on and bridging huge distances of time and space, relying on the internet. So very networked interactions, but they're also extremely remote, casual, and quite transient for all their intimacy. And I think some of this sense of melancholy reflects even the studio portraits, of which Eddie is one. Go back to it. The body here is notable for its unknowability, its utter anonymity, and I think that's only underscored by the attachment of a personal name in its title. That enhances our sense that we don't know what this is, rather than giving us any information. There is no hint of personality in this nude or feeling. There is no sense of a pose, though no doubt the sitter was indeed choosing to hold one. The air is kind of antiseptic or medicinal. It's painted just like it's anything, rather than a particularly privileged subject of the Western tradition, which is not to say not without great skill and energy, but with a kind of disinterest. I realise I risk a kind of tenuousness here with this comparison, but when I look at this painting of Hempton's on the left, it's called Kamal from 2015, I immediately thought of this Robert Mapplethorpe image, Peter Reed from 1980. And while they're very similar in image and composition, I feel that there is a kind of definite, if I admit entirely ineffable, sense of difference, or even a kind of loss. What I feel is gone between the former and the latter is a kind of personality or expressiveness. If Mapplethorpe's image feels charged, Hempton's is kind of listless or docile. So going back to this nude, I think we can see this as a kind of threshold moment, not in a chronological sense, but between these two tendencies of ways of representing the body and its flesh. The expressive potential of the body as an object of fascination, celebration, dignity, and meaning seems, in the one hand, or at first glance, at its most turgid and inflated, and at the same time it seems to collapse and deflate into this kind of anonymity or meaninglessness. It's like a balloon being caught at the moment that a pin starts to prick it. And this image of a pinprick made me think of one of the works in the exhibition downstairs from a much earlier era. This is an untitled work from 1984 by the artist David Wojnarowicz. It's made with stencils and airbrush onto canvas. It's hard to read at first, it took me a while looking at it. I don't know, probably because I've been looking at Hempton's work. I saw this kind of long, drooping figure on sort of form on the left here above the fingers, a sort of penile somehow. But actually, and particularly when you look at an earlier work from about 2 years earlier called Jack, from which used the same stencil, you can see more clearly that this is a figure injecting themselves in an arm. This is one arm here, and they're injecting themselves here, and this tie hangs from their neck. There's a kind of tension here in the image between these strong linear images as a result of the stencil, the face, the hand, the tie, but also a sense of they're collapsed. There's a kind of bruised quality as if everything's being smushed together, which in my mind also evokes, I think, subtly the bruise which comes with a bad injection when junk gets into the wrong part of the skin. The way that the image is tightly cropped, a bit like Hempton's, you lose a sense of the overall narrative or meaning. Everything is slightly off-center and unstable and risks flowing into one another. If we contrast this with a work from a similar era by an artist also in Wojnarowicz's New York 80s milieu, this is Jody Comes Clean from 1982 by Martin Wong. It's from a whole series of paintings he made, for which he became renowned, called Paintings for the Hearing Impaired, that he started in 1980, in which he would translate fragments of found text, usually from tabloid headlines or advertising slogans, into finger sign language, which are then painted like here. And so the title of the work is actually what's being spelled out in this series of hand gestures. Wong's interest in the use of this of sign language has been read in terms of identifying with society's silent or unheard subjects, and additionally in terms of relating to the codedness of the queer world, the language of cruising and hankies. But for my purpose today, what I find interesting in the painting is it shows an actually quite moving belief in the body's capacity or ability to communicate. Sign language is a physical language of gesture which results in recognized meaning. But it is one which happens totally through the body. Dan Cameron, in fact, in his essay on the painter in Sweet Oblivion, The Urban Landscapes of Martin Wong, published in 1988, notes in his essay about this work that Darwin once hypothesized that speech was nothing but a mouth pantomime in which the vocal organs unconsciously attempt to mimic gestures of the hands. So rather than being about language, this is specifically about a kind of language of the body and the body's potential to create meaning. If you flip 2 years on to Wojnarowicz's work, we see here not a process of clear signaling, but a kind of decomposition of signs. The gesture of the hands here is not used to communicate something, but actually to release or to trigger, it seems, the very process of undoing. It is not to say that this work somehow lacks meaning, but rather the level of meaning has shifted from the form of the body, think of the form of the hands, to its matter, from the shape of the hand to the bruise on the skin, or going beneath the skin. And in this way, I started to think about what this exhibition might mean in trying to shift our attention from the body to flesh. Now, in the same way that some of the works, as I saw with Hempton's, might appear to look, at first glance, to be of a body or about the body, it can be equally hard to identify works that seem to depict the flesh, or that I believe depict the flesh, but at first glance, that's not apparent. And I'm going to speak for a little while about the work of Max Hooper-Schneider as a way of teasing out how the flesh can be, I think, very present in a work, even though it's not immediately visible. This is a 2014 work by the artist called From Death Row to Purgatory. The artist Max Hooper-Schneider. It was commissioned for a project at the Paramount Ranch Art Fair in California. It's a standard issue, mass-produced coffin, which is filled, and sadly I can't find any documentation which shows you the contents, but was filled with water in a kind of ecosystem that contained goldfish, crayfish, and tortoises. At the same edition of the fair, Hooper-Schneider showed this work, Morphonegesis System, medium section of female pelvis and fire-bellied newt. This is how the writer Jonathan Griffin described his encounter with the work for Art Review. In a corner of a wooden shack, wet black newts nestled in a model of a woman's cervix, blue lit and mist-shrouded in their glass tank. The sculpture seemed like a glimpse into the post-human future. Now, I think at this moment we can talk a little bit about what it means to talk about a post-human future, which is a concept that's not explicitly, but I think very relevant to the concerns of the exhibition. The way that Griffin is using here the idea of post-human is, I think, in a kind of apocalyptic sense. He ends that same piece of writing with the claim that Hooper-Schneider's work shows us how we may be at the beginning of the end, which means the end of the human race. The tradition of this kind of imagination of the ruins of human civilization, taken over by other forms, colonized by other animals, animates the works of, among others, Ian Cheng and Pierre Hui. And it's interesting that both Cheng and Hooper Schneider both worked as assistants in Hui's studio. This intellectual condition of thinking the condition of being after the human, or a subjectivity which is no longer human, is kind of works in parallel to this work. And in its least palatable form, its kind of shadowy self, it becomes a kind of nihilism or anti-humanism. The philosopher Rosie Braidotti, in her 2013 book, The Posthuman, she starts off by offering 4 vignettes of what, a bit like the body, this term posthuman, which is often bandied about, might really mean in a concrete sense. She gives them, as in her words, examples of the contradictions offered by our posthuman historical conditions. And as an example of how the idea of the posthuman can devolve or debase itself into a kind of nihilistic anti-humanism, she offers this story. In November 2007, Pekka Arik Ovanen, an 18-year-old Finnish boy, opened fire on his classmates in a high school near Helsinki, killing 8 people before shooting himself. Prior to the carnage, the young killer posted a video on YouTube in which he showed himself wearing a t-shirt with the caption, "Humanity is overrated." So some of the borderline comic, horrific quality of the story, I think, finds a parallel in Hooper Schneider's From Death Row to Purgatory, this pink coffin. It makes it hard for me to read this work as a kind of uncomplicated projection of life surviving after humanity, but it seems rather to engage the fact that that fantasy is a kind of fantasy, a source of irrational, even perverse pleasure, to imagine ourselves overtaken. This isn't, to me, an entirely serious work, but one which sort of mocks some of the strangeness of the functions that thinking about the world after us actually does in discourse. But even if we were to read this work as a straightforward rendering of post-human conditions in this apocalyptic sense, and it does, of course, depict the resting place of the human dead being overtaken by fish, precisely this reading also complicates our possible understandings of morphogenesis system. Put another way, if the former work shows humanity's resting place, who or what can we say has died in this work? The human presence is indicated not by the coffin, but by a diagram, which to my mind does not easily signal morbidity, simply put, because it never lived. Moreover, and I think more excitingly, the fact that it seems to me a very deliberate choice that the diagram is of the female human pelvis, which is the source, of course, of life. So I think, then, what we see figured in this work is not so much an image of life taking over after human life, but rather a kind of sense of human life continuing. Unfamiliar, of course, hybridized, trans-species, but nevertheless recognizably human, a kind of flesh of our flesh. In a recent piece, the critic Chris Feet-Wasiak, talking about this tendency in contemporary art, suggested that we embrace artificiality and synthesis and a kind of optimism, where at least our DNA, along with our latex and cellophane, are another tributary into the nascent mutual ecology. So with these in mind, we'll turn to the works by Hooper Schneider, which are in the exhibitions downstairs. And these are 2 works from the series Pet Semiosis. These are details from, on the left, Leprosy Hebrew and Malaria Hindi, which are both made this year. Their titles are derived from the names of diseases written in particular scripts, which are then spelled out in the neon that you can see illuminating at the back of the boxes. As you can see, they're festooned with material and objects both naturally occurring, like porcupine quills, as well as manufactured. There are lots of plastic plants. And similarly, though I don't have a picture of it, the Image 2015 work, Accidental Menagerie, contains, set in resin, human bones, maggots, a snake, fishtails, as well as a revolver, razor blades, and gelatin candy. By titling these jostling collisions of organic and inorganic after diseases, the artist perhaps privileges the natural side, so suggesting that what he is really depicting is like the virus, something naturally occurring. At the same time, he insinuates by choosing viruses a suggestion of corruption or mutation. And there's a quote in the exhibition leaflet from the artist's mother, the critic Barbara Hooper, who says that Hooper Schneider's works denature nature, breeding monstrous hybrids and uncanny assemblages. While I've mentioned Pierre Hui as a kind of forerunner for Hooper Schneider's practice, I think there are a couple of others that are very salient to mention. One are the cubes of Tetsumi Kudo, which I don't have an image of, but which similarly mix registers of matter modeled limbs, penises, for example, alongside plants and trashy detritus. Kudo's work is sort of infused with this mood of panic and disaster. He would paint the outside of his boxes like dice that you roll to create a sense of kind of uneasy, everything being subject to random chance. And in his 1968 piece, Garden of the Metamorphosis, in the space capsule, which was a room-sized cube that you could enter, he had written inside the phrase, for nostalgic purposes, suggesting it was some kind of monument for, again, after humanity's extinction. But another series of work which I think is relevant are the technological reliquaries created by the late American artist Paul Tech. This is a picture of Tech taken by his partner, the photographer Peter Hujar, on a trip to Sicily in 1963. And this is inside the famous catacombs at Palermo, where hundreds or even thousands of bodies are embalmed and preserved. About this experience of this visit, Tech wrote, "There are about 8,000 corpses here, not skeletons, corpses, decorating the walls, and the corridors are filled with windowed coffins. I opened one and picked up what I thought was a piece of paper. It was a piece of dried thigh. I felt strangely relieved and free. It delighted me that bodies could be used to decorate a room like flowers." So when he returned from this trip, Tech began his work on the series of technological reliquaries, often casually referred to as meat or flesh pieces. These are rectangular boxes of plexiglass which contain replicas of meat or skin, which he made from beeswax, resin, and sometimes even bronze. This one is an untitled work from 1966 in the collection of the Whitney. So you can see just at an immediate glance the possible visual parallels between Hooper Schneider's cubes and Tech's. The dynamism of this piece is a product of the chaotic mix. It's not so much a product of the chaotic mixing of materials that you find in Hooper Schneider's great profusions, but the contrast between the clean, cool allure of the case and the raw, muddy quality of its contents, as well as its bloody associations. Tech is here responding somewhat caustically to the, as he saw it, evacuation of ethical concerns in the minimalism that was prevalent in contemporary New York during his time. With the iconic Meat Piece with Warhope Brillo box from 1965, he responded even more directly to contemporary art, obviously referencing the Brillo boxes which Andy Warhol had shown the previous year at the Stable Gallery. Of this work, the late critic Stuart Morgan, writing in Frieze in 1995, summed up the fundamental opposition between the vision found in Warhol's work and in Tech's response to it, writing this: "If Warhol implied no ideas but in things, Tech countered no ideas but in flesh." So if we go back to Hooper Schneider's cases, looking at them in light of Tech's boxes, which I think is, if not a conscious, then an unconscious reference, we can see a kind of bodying forth or an incarnation of precisely this idea that no ideas but in flesh. Ideas, in a sense, are contained by the presence of language that is very clearly illuminates the whole space and is centered. The fact that this is written information. These cubes pulse with energy, signals, viral information. And in fact, this title, semiosis, implies a mutation or passing on of forms, intellectual forms, that is. The fact that the flickering neon signs form not just letters and words, but spell specifically the names of diseases, even in a funny way, evokes William Burroughs' assertion that the word is now a virus. So if in these works we see the incarnation of the principle, no ideas but in flesh, we can see where the ideas are, but where perhaps you might still ask is the flesh. What I've been trying to argue, both in Hooper Schneider's way of mixing the inanimate and the animate, to suggest that animal life and human life, for example, or plastic life and moving life, can somehow be coextensive or extend one another, as well as in the visual echoes of text work. I think that we can see these boxes as a kind of lump or pound of flesh. It's flesh that's networked, pulsing, technological, mechanical, but flesh nevertheless. And if there are any residual doubts, I think it's a very easy visual comparison, which is, this is in the same way, if you remember, that Hooper Schneider used the diagram of the female pelvis in one of his works to suggest that he is aware of this canon of biological diagrams. This is a very typical, this is from the Encyclopedia Britannica, but it's the kind of diagram that everybody reads in a school textbook. And I just let those two images sit alongside each other for a moment. So I think in these respects, Hooper Schneider can be grouped with the artists who were explored elsewhere in the exhibition, all based in America and Western Europe, who display this same fascination and confusion at what lies beneath the skin. The locus of their identification with the body is not in its form, but in the array, as I say, of networks, processes, ideas, activities, codes, materials, and infusions that crisscross the body beneath the skin in these kind of fragments or lumps of flesh. You see the exhibition curators write in their introductory leaflet that they refocus attention from the body to its more basic matter, flesh, in its material, cultural, sexual, medical, or cosmetic aspects. Flesh is the matter, they write, of empowered bodies, informed bodies, operating through networks and fields of information to perform, transform, transcribe, reconfigure, or reinvent themselves. And with this idea of the ability of the flesh to reinvent or reconfigure itself, this is just another, and again, I'm working purely from a kind of visual, sense of visual analogy. When I look at Hooper Schneider's boxes, the other thing that I immediately thought of aside from these diagrams was these images you can find on the internet. These relate to a strange condition called Morgellons Syndrome, which is a psychosomatic disorder suffered by about 12,000 people, primarily in North America. Leslie Jamison, in her last book, The Empathy Exams, wrote a long essay about visiting a conference of Morgellons syndrome sufferers, and I'm going to read a quote from it. For me, Morgellons disease started as a novelty. People said they had a strange ailment, and no one, or hardly anyone, believed them. But there were a lot of them, reportedly 12,000, and their numbers were growing. Their illness manifested itself in many ways, including fatigue, pain, and formication, a sensation of insects crawling under the skin. But the defining symptom was always the same, fibers emerging from their bodies. Not just fibers, but fuzz, specks, and even crystals. They didn't know what this stuff was, or where it came from, or why it was there, but they knew, and this was what mattered, the important word, that it was real. Now, Morgellons, as it probably won't surprise you, has been investigated by the Federal Health Authority and was found that they could find no scientific information that it did really exist. And yet, if you search for Morgellons on the internet, you can find countless images of this, allegedly made by sufferers as they see it, documenting their own struggles. This person on the left has even labeled this image. I think they believe that what's inside them is a nanobot, a sort of technological device implanted by the government that seems to have been growing legs, whereas this fibrous growth is much more common to the self-delusions of the Morgellon sufferer. And I think this is one way to think about the idea of the flesh which can reconfigure or recreate itself, almost in an imaginary sense. Now, to get into the actual phenomenology of whether the sufferers of this disease are consciously implanting these things in themselves, whether they're finding stuff that would just regularly be like detritus, find themselves on their skin, too big a topic to get into. But this idea that what we can find in ourselves is actually, in some sense, both real and imagined, which is the only way I could characterize an image like this, I think connects quite powerfully with the idea of this flesh that we can configure ourselves. Stay with the diagram and think about skin versus flesh for a moment. What I find particularly useful about this idea of looking at flesh as a topic is it contrasts with the idea of skin or epidermis or covering, which just a couple of years ago seemed to be a very prevalent topic. Writing in Freeze magazine, for example, in 2013, Amy Sherlock characterized the particularly glossy sheen that conceals a hinted-at inner messiness, which she found variously in the work of a circle of London artists, including Nick Deshay, Alice Channer, Magli Reyes, Ed Atkins, and Helen Martin. Taking the title of Reyes' 2013 HD video, Highly Liquid, Sherlock wrote that this high liquidity is an aesthetic of packaging, one in which sleek surfaces are proxies for skins. These artists are likewise interested in the skin edge as the fragile boundary of containment, the line that keeps the neat from the messy, the body's own vacuum packaging. I'm not trying to give, as you can tell, a very rigorous art historic account of these kind of shifts, but I do think it's useful to think of this skin moment and today's exhibition as part of a kind of loose trajectory in which the artists are moving from one level below it, so from the skin, but pushing now underneath it. This is a work from his from 2012, which was referenced in the Sherlock piece I just quoted, called Slugs. In that essay, Sherlock allies Deshay firmly with her notional liquid group for his sagging billows of vacuum-formed plastic. The center of this work doesn't look so 3D in this reproduction, but this is a sort of mound of vacuum-formed plastic, which, while transparent, clear, smooth, and seamless, conveys a level of visceral, choppy texture. It was molded around plaster, which the artist churns in a state between being liquid and solid. In this sense, it communicates something of this in-between state of materiality. But at the same time, it fixes them in the finality of the vacuum packing. It appears being transparent like a dam or a shield, or indeed a skin. It seems to control unruliness rather than releasing itself up into it. If you skip ahead to 2014, I think you can see one way that we can apply this idea of the shift from the skin to what lies beneath. This is a 2014 exhibition by Des Hay at the Glasgow Sculpture Studios, which is called Darling Gutter. You can see, this is a detail here from another book, it's all the same room, but I've overlaid two images. The pieces that are displayed are cast from jesmonite, and they were made over the shape of expanding polyurethane. The final forms which the polyurethane took while setting is to some extent random, but it seems quite deliberate that the resemblance that they have is to something intestinal, the inside of the guts. Deshay has placed these squiggly human intestines, as one critic, curator Paul Peroni, described them, on elements of the room's central heating system. You can see these pipes, these red ones which is installed, and these along the lines, which actually connect to the main central heating system of the room. Also enhances the sense that we see these as digestive apparatus. They circulate warm liquids and in this sense mimics the basic function of the digestive system, Peroni writes. In connecting his sculptures to the central heating system, Deshay draws a parallel between his work and the body itself. Central heating, like a body, is a network connected but discrete organs that function together interrelatedly and homeostatically. A heating system with a thermostat aims to preserve an environment at a target heat, just like a body does. Now you could read Des Hay's interventions in this as a kind of parasite which attaches itself to the body, or as outgrowths of the normally functioning body itself. But either way, there's a very clear parallel drawn between the work, the industrial tools, and the functioning of the body itself. In drawing attention to pipes, there's an element also of a kind of industrial nostalgia in the work. And the press release did quote a passage from Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, a 19th century epic called The Paris Under Paris, which describes 19th century sewer systems. And it's interesting, this echoes with a quote from Mark Grief from his recent essay Against Exercise, writing about the modern gym. He says, "Modern exercise makes you acknowledge the machine operating inside yourself. Nothing can make you believe we harbour nostalgia for factory work but a modern gym." Yet Peroni sees this, while containing industrial references, sees this work as also having a kind of futuristic element. He compares the threading of the thermostatic system throughout the installation as almost cybernetic, lines of informational feedback connecting individual objects to a broader regulatory system. We turn to the work of Dora Boudor, who is contained in the exhibition downstairs. We can say something of this same pipe fixation. This work from 2016, rather than smothering or ornamenting the pipe system with decorative sculptures like Deshay does, what Boudor does is make the conduits themselves sprout and grow in sort of this great profusion. If Deshay's works are minimally functional, Boudor's pipes seem to have a more baroque configuration, more complex or organic. They look almost like strands of coral or something growing. And in fact, at the same time, the overall shape of the piece seems to resemble some kind of organ. It could be a brain or almost a liver. When these works were displayed at the Swiss Institute in New York in 2015, the exhibition text, in fact, declared them to be conceived as a hybrid of heating infrastructure and blood vessels. Boudor describes her process in creating these works as one of reanimation, which is a term with kind of Gothic echoes of Frankenstein, of bodies, artificial bodies being brought to life. And the history and imagery of sci-fi is indeed a central theme in her works. The three boxes in the center here are replicas of the garage lockup, which Bruce Willis's character inhabits in the film The Fifth Element, 1997 film by Luc Besson. I think whatever else it's doing, these references to cinematic or fictional realities integrated in the center of this kind of industrial tool body, this is comparable, I think, to the presence of the neon virus signs in Hooper Schneider's work, signaling that whatever makes this body up is not just matter, but information. In this way, it puts another spin on the notion of informed, networked flesh, the conjunction of organic and inorganic, of a pre-existing materiality and a self-generated or imagined substance. Now, it might be easy to get carried away at this point to think of this as something extremely modern or contemporaneous, this idea of the technological or tool body. But actually, of course, the notion of the mechanical body has a very long lineage. A quote from Roy Porter's book, Flesh in the Age of Reason, which is a study of thinking about the body and identity in 18th century England. He writes, "Mechanical philosophers looked upon the body as a piece of machinery. Investigators were spurred to view living creatures mechanistically as ingenious contraptions made up of skillfully articulated components, elements functioning as levers, pulleys, cogs, pipe, and wheels, in line with the laws of mechanics, kinetics, hydrostatics, and so forth. The body became a machine carnis, a machine of the flesh. Faced with the question, what makes bodies tick, the obvious answer given by the mechanical philosophers was that they went by clockwork." Now, the image of the body as clockwork is quite literally figured in one of the first exhibits in the exhibition. This is another piece by Wojciech, who made the stencil spray paint work we looked at earlier. This is Time Brain from around the same era. In the text by DRAF, I'm going to quote the curator's discussion of this work briefly. They suggest that the presence of the clock alludes to time running out, a blunt allusion to the grim terminal nature of Wojciechowicz's condition. He was to die of AIDS, tragically young. And while I'm not here to counter that, I do want to look at another possible interpretation. And while I'm going to defer to talking much about the AIDS crisis to the panel which is coming next, who are much better informed than me, there is one aspect of this which is salient to this conversation. I was having a conversation with a friend in a bar in New York earlier this year who was talking about wanting to write a book about art of the AIDS crisis and was celebrating it for its particular, its embrace of the abject, of its messiness, of the grimness, of works by the likes of Andreas Serrano and his Piss Christ, etc. And I was suggesting to him that what I found actually was peculiarly dated about the art of that generation is that today, living with HIV for somebody in the developed West with access to healthcare is not really a matter of messiness, but so much as a clean, medicalized process of constant pill ingestion. And I've had a chance to look at lots of works by the artist Felix Gonzalez-Torres, who's another iconic artist of the AIDS crisis, including at the Whitney this year. They had one of his candy pieces, which was a large pile of individually wrapped, foil-wrapped candies that were measured out to weigh the same as a human body, and many of them were made to weigh the same as his lover Ross Laycock and his weight just before he died. And it suggested for a long time these candy pieces, in taking them, the visitors were invited to take individual candies away, and in this sense the body diminishes in this kind of ritual and semi-religious sort of moment. What it reminded me of, more than anything, taking an individual pill, unwrapping it, and seeing so many more, is actually as the huge weight of drug taking that so many of us have to do now, whatever our conditions. And I think this is where I find this work really interesting, of the sense, and what one conclusion you can make from the impact of the AIDS crisis on the visual imagination is actually its kind of medicalization. For the first time, you have medicine understood as a human right or as a need, as an identitarian issue, as a practical, visceral response to a real crisis. You can find in the debate today, raging in this country, about free access to pre-exposure prophylaxis for HIV, or PrEP, that actually the debate has become entirely medicalized, revolves solely around our right to drugs. And I think there's some strange kind of acceptance but unease you can find in a work like this, and here I speak purely subjectively. Very often when we take pharmaceuticals, we find a strange sense of paranoia that we can feel our brains slightly changing. We talk about our brain chemistry being adapted, whether or not we're taking psychotropics or mood-altering ones. And I see in this work not a sense of the terminal feeling of decline, but something of the strange experience of knowing that what is keeping one alive somehow something technical or mechanical. Which, as I say, is both a symptom very much, I think, of our pharmaceutical culture today, but also relates to a very long-established view of the mechanical or technological body. So this gives us some context to think about some of these tropes as we look at them now. Given that half of the people in this country take prescription pharmaceuticals on a regular basis, according to a 2014 report, I've often felt that mass-produced medicine is a curiously underplayed topic in contemporary art. We have, for example, the pill cabinets and the Arzette's pharmacies that Damien Hirst made in the 90s and the early 2000s. More recently, I know artists like Marina Pinsky, this is her exhibition Dyed Channel from the Kunsthalle Basel in 2016, earlier this year, which explored that city's historical entwinement with the production of pharmaceuticals. And these are ceramic replicas of ancient Greek tablets with markings on them that she's packaged in these oversized blister packs. You can also mention, though I haven't seen it yet, Lucy Beach's video Pharmacon at the last Liverpool Biennial, which explored some of the appeal and disgust of drug taking. But the pharmaceutical flesh is a concern, returning now to Dora Budor. This is another work, not on display here, but it was at the Gallery Ramekin Crucible in New York earlier this year. And it's called, well, its full title reads, "We see you so often these days. How nice it is to find a patient who regards his status seriously. What status? His status as a patient. People tend to forget they are patients. Once they leave the doctor's office or the hospital, they simply put it out their minds. But you are all permanent patients, like it or not. I am a doctor, you are the patient. Doctor doesn't cease being a doctor at close of day, neither should patient." The title is a long quote from the film Scanners by David Cronenberg. And in the same way that Budor incorporates elements from The Fifth Element in her sculpture downstairs, this work is entirely circles around tropes and imagery from the Cronenberg film. In the film Scanners, the lead character is an artist who has telepathic abilities, which he's got after his mother, while pregnant, took a new test drug called ephemeral, which as a side effect, all of the babies produced from the mothers taking them had this telepathic ability, which quite obviously parallels real-life cases such as the thalidomide drug that was taken in the 1980s in this country. The artist in the film works his whole life to build the head, and Budor actually found the set designer's model for this piece and made a mold from it, which is then what this is a recreation of. What she's done around the back of the head is installed this strange sort of seating area. I've included two views. And this is a reference to this work from 1970. This is an interior design by the furniture designer Werner Panton that he actually made as a commission for the chemical company AG Bayer in Germany, who wanted something that could show off the potential use of some of their chemical productions. And to bring the interest in the chemical or pharmaceutical full circle, Budor has painted the outside of the structure in a mixture containing the, what's the name of the substance? Sorry, bear with me. It's a xenohormone, which means a laboratory synthesized hormone called bisphenol A, which is used in a variety of contexts in North America, though has a number of health concerns, probably from the kind of people who also believe in Morgellons attached to it. So I'm just going to leave this for a moment. So in this world in which fiction and the real blend with a mixture of industrially synthesized and naturally occurring, the chemicals or pharmaceuticals are in a way everywhere present. They have this kind of, there is a sense of control in this work, not least from the sense of the structure, these wires and bolts, which resembles a Lizanov apparatus, which is what you use to heal a broken leg. And in this sense, Dora Budor shows the influence of the author Paul B. Preciado, in whose Testo Junkie, which I'm about to read a little bit from, prophesizes that we now live in a pharmaco-pornographic era. I'm just going to read some excerpts from her book to give you a sense of her thesis. Actually, what do we look at? We can have on the background, this is an image called Passion in the Pharmacy by Issy Wood, which is also an exhibition downstairs. So Preciado writes, "The invention of the contraceptive pill, the first biochemical technique enabling the separation between heterosexual practice and reproduction, was a direct result of the expansion of endocrinal experimentation in the post-war era, what you could call, twisting the Eisenhower term, the sex-gender industrial complex." She links the creation of the pill to a change in policy towards sexuality, the closure of the regulated brothel system in France in 1946, the founding of Playboy in 1953, the release of Deep Throat, the first widely successful pornographic film in 1972. She connects also the roots of the pharmaceutical industry or its entwinement with the military complex, in particular the development of opiates and barbiturates for soldiers, She talks particularly about secobarbital, better known as the red pill, becoming one of the drugs of the rock underground, even though it originated as a potential military device. She also talks about the expansion of prosthetic and face and body reconstruction techniques in the army, and links these to the development of the first facelifts in cosmetic surgery at the same time. And similar to what Budor does by paralleling chemical developments and the development of the plastics industry with the inside of this work, Preciado also relates all of these developments to the expansion of the plastics industry. So what she concludes is, I'm trying to find a good summing up quote. During the second half of the 20th century, the mechanisms of this pharmacopornographic regime are materialized in the fields of psychology, sexology, and endocrinology. If science has reached the hegemonic place that it occupies as a discourse and a practice in our culture, it is because it works as a material discourse's apparatus of bodily production. Technoscience has established its material authority by transforming the concepts of psyche, libido, consciousness, femininity and masculinity, heterosexuality and homosexuality, intersexuality and transsexuality into tangible realities. They are manifest in commercial chemical substances and molecules, biotype bodies, and fungible technological goods managed by multinationals. So there's a great emphasis in Preciado's world vision on the amount of pharmaceuticals we consume, but also in a whole new understanding that gives us of our own forms. If we turn to the work of Athena Papadopoulos downstairs, I just want to think about this trope of consumption. This is a detail we found. I mean, you have echoes here, as we looked on in earlier works, of the tool body or the technological body, that these stools seem to function both as furniture or as industrial apparatus, but also contain feet, and they're covered in this strange, decaying, fleshy fabric. But what I find really fascinating is the fact that they're inset, they kind of enshrine these solid resin-cast blocks that appear to represent a sort of chemical soup, suggest the contents of a stomach or something being digested, and particularly in this detail where you have this comic toucan imbibing or drinking from the mixture. This emphasis on consumption is defining our identity or defining our bodies in some sense, that we are what we ingest. You can also find a version of this in the work of Justin Fitzpatrick in the exhibition downstairs, who talks often about his work wanting to represent a kind of cannibalism. And you find, I think, in this painting on the left, some sense of the form of the body which eats and redigests and reproduces itself. It kind of loops in on itself like an Ouroboros, the snake that bites its tail. And it's also weirdly amorphous. It has this kind of phallic head, but it's got a sort of gut-like body. It's a self-cannibalizing, self-ingesting, constantly morphing body. Preciado writes that the pharmacopornographic body favors no organ over any other, so that the penis possesses no more orgasmic force than the vagina, the eye, or the toe. This strength is its indeterminate capacity. It has no gender. It is neither male nor female, neither human nor animal. It does not know the difference between being excited, being exciting, and being excited with. And in the comparison works, these are also by Justin Fitzpatrick. I think you see some of this sense of a completely drifting, amorphous movement of desire. Within both of these animal heads, you see the figures of men involved in banal but quite intimate settings. Here, one massaging the soldiers, the other you can't see so well, but this is people working out at the gym. And there was a suggestion in the leaflet text that these moments of kind of male watching or interaction signal like a dog whistle. There's a high pitch, unheard signal, and hence the presence of the animal. But I think in the context of Preciado's quotes, you can see that there's a weird sense of which desire is shifting, as it does in the body, moving through, constantly being ingested, circulated, reused, re-eaten, reformed in these images. They're both animal and have a kind of banal humanity to them. They involve images of touch, but also of imagination. There's unreal color and a sort of shifting Gestalt-like sense of where the real subject or focus is. Who is consuming what in these works? Where is the desire and where is the subject? Again, like Hannah Black's video, we're inclined to say everywhere and nowhere. I'm going to talk more briefly now, as we come to a close, about some of the other works in the exhibition, which might be said to illustrate aspects of Preciado's thesis. Another quote from the book: "Pharmacopornographic biocapitalism does not produce things. It produces mobile ideas, living organs, symbols, desire, chemical reactions, and conditions of the soul," which I think actually might work as a fairly good subtitle for these works by Fitzpatrick. She also writes, "There is nothing to discover anymore in sex or sexual identity. There is no inside. The truth about sex is not a disclosure, it is sex design." And in this work downstairs by Kelly Akashi, I think you have a sense of this imagination of a body that lacks an inside. This is laid out on a long table, a bit like a dissection or an operating table. But what you have is not a whole form, but these discrete organs which seem to belong together but without any clear system. And they're all transparent, shiny, and kind of inaccessible. You couldn't find really a clearer illustration of the idea that there is no inside in the pharmaceutical body. Similarly, this work by Reynard Jerez, which also interestingly lies on a table just nearby, in some sense resembles, I think, with this kind of green color, a fallen soldier, but might also be an anatomical study. The sense of insideness here, or the lacking inside, I think is demonstrated by or is signaled rather, by the use of a single material or fabric which covers everything. Everything is made of just one skin with nothing beneath it, it seems. And particularly the way that there is this strange looping spine-like figure where a thorax or a chest might be. It's almost like he's inviting you to say, try and dig into me, there's nothing there. You get some of this sense of hyper-transparency or hyper-visible surface without anything behind, also in this work by Jean-Marie Apriou, which is downstairs. Particularly this figure on the left, which vaguely resembles a face emerging from a pregnant body, but again has no interior. Preciado quotes at one point in her book Donna Haraway, who was a great theorist of the cybernetic or cyborg woman, particularly in the late 80s, but also in the 90s. And there's one quote from a 90s book in which she writes, "Embodiment is significant prothesis." And just as the final part of the talk, I want to look at this idea of prothesis, which has been sort of hanging in the wings all the time. You can see both in the Jerez work with these long extended tentacles that come from the face, and also in this Apriou on the right, these long tentacle-like forms which connect bits of the head to the body, adding circulation, adding flow, extensions of the body rather than part of it itself. Something of the idea of the prosthesis, like the prosthetic leg or the prosthetic arm, something separate from the body which is added to enhance it. This was a really popular concept, largely as a result of thinkers like Haraway, became very dominant for a time. And writers like David Marquand have recently started to challenge it as examples of hyperbole. He quotes in one of his recent collections a user of an artificial leg who, on reading some prosthesis theory, says that they didn't feel like a Superman or a cyborg, but somebody who was slightly inconvenienced. And as Sally O'Reilly notes in her book, that where we draw the distinction between a prosthesis proper and something as simple as, say, contact lenses is not immediately clear. And yet, just this year, this is an exhibition which opened at the Henry Moore Institute in Yorkshire, which is called The Body Extended, Sculpture and Prothesis, and we see a sort of attempt to revisit and maybe to revitalize our understanding of these extensions of the body. What I was particularly struck by, I haven't visited this, I just saw this as an installation view, was this work, which is by Louise Bourgeois from 1985. It's called Henriette. And from a distance, I really thought it was a phone handset dangling from a cord like you might find in a phone box. Which leads rather neatly to another work from the exhibition by Jason Matthew Lee, who collects, as part of his practice, goes around New York and collects these containers, these tins are old American phone boxes, now defunct, which he collects disused ones from off the streets of New York and then repurposes them. And it's interesting that this is the only time in this exhibition that you see something literally a prothesis appear, which I think is very interesting, and against next to a skull. And something about the rhyme of this leg inside the phone box and Bourgeois' leg resembling a phone. It got me thinking about the ability of technology to become defunct. And the fact that it's placed next to a skull, which, as the curator's note, is a traditional symbol of the memento mori, or of a horizon or limit to life. What kind of message can we see in the pairing of the skull and the leg? Well, one might be that the prosthesis a bit like prosthetic theory is no longer fashionable, is perhaps now defunct. Just like the skull is dead, that in our new exciting pharmacopornographic world, full of chemical extensions, hormonal infusions, and etc., we have no more need to rely on such basic material like prosthesis. We are already adding the prosthesis inside our bodies, that we produce a form like Jerez's, which has no need for an extra leg. It's totally formed of its own self and cannot be extended. But another view might be to sound a note of skepticism about the potential for future development of all of the things we've been discussing. Perhaps the point of pairing the skull and the prosthesis is to suggest precisely their similarity, but in that sense to sound a note of caution about any sense about how ongoing attempts to extend the body really will be. In the same way that probably nobody once imagined that phones would become quite so defunct as they are now, perhaps all of the technologies which Preciado writes about so breathlessly might similarly become one day completely defunct. We are faced with the idea that perhaps we are in the same way that we are able to extend the body with these other implements, we are likely to expire in the same way that the implements do, or the implements will expire just the same way that the body does. In moving with the idea of flesh away from the macrocosmic form to the networked, active, material flesh at the microscopic level, we are, as we've seen, faced with an array of extensions, coexistences, interminglings, with tools, with pipes, with drugs, with chemicals, with animals, with the imagined, with fibers, with crystals. We can see fundamentally flesh as something coextensive. Think of the famous Bible quote, all flesh is grass. We see ourselves expanding out into the world, our bodies becoming one with everything around us. This is another work by Issy Wood, which is, as I see it, the final work of the exhibition, placed on the last wall right at the end. And we could see that vision as a sense of a human dominance, of having potentially no limit to our power, of being able to extend and co-mix with everything around us. Or we could see that precisely this makes us weak, makes us likely to decay, makes us as limited as all other material around us. Kaya Silverman, in her 90s book, Flesh of My Flesh, writes about the inspiration and mythology of Ovid. This is a painting by Antonio Palladio, describing one of the myths that Ovid writes about in his Metamorphoses. This is a nymph Daphne who, being chased by Apollo to avoid his advances, is turned into a tree. And she talks about analogy. And I'm conscious that in this lecture I've used a lot of analogies to try and make my point, visual analogies. The analogy between Dora Budor, say, and the shape of an organ. Try to find the image. Between Dora Budor and the shape of an organ, or between a diagram of a piece of flesh and Max Superschneider's boxes. And I'm aware that analogy can be tenuous sometimes. Just because something looks like something else, it doesn't mean it really is, or that it's meaningfully related to them. But I want to stay with analogy for a moment, because it's something that Silverman writes about in Flesh of My Flesh. She says, analogy itself is a kind of flesh, and this ontological kinship can be the starting point for another kind of human relationality. Leonardo, she talks about Leonardo da Vinci, was fascinated by the aging process and dissected and drew many corpses. He also repeats one of Ovid's central claims, that everything derives from the same flesh. These correspondences connect us to both ourselves and others, promoting transformation rather than stasis, equality rather than hierarchy, and an unfinished universality rather than stasis, rather than a closed order. These rhymes teach us that we should revere all creatures and keep them safe, because everything emerges from the same flesh and has the same ontological weight. We also relate to ourselves analogically, because we do not have an identity, because we are constantly changing, but we also do not break into a million pieces because our shapes resemble the others. Finitude, she writes, is the most capacious and enabling of the attributes we share with others, and this is, I think, the crucial point. Because unlike the particular way in which each of us looks, thinks, walks, that connect us to only a few other beings, finitude connects us to every other being, since finitude marks the point where we end and the others begins, spatially and temporarily. It also makes room for them. And acknowledging these limits allows us to experience the expansiveness for which we yearn, because it gives us a powerful sense of our emplacement within a larger whole. So as a final conclusion, perhaps what can we understand from the fact that this most contemporary work, confronting technology in the here and now, and from the last 50 years, might in this way bring us back to a sense of finitude, of the biblical quote of 15th century painting, this understanding of the very weakness of the flesh. What I think it shows us is that the permanent strand running through all of these ideas, no matter how we can combine our flesh with other devices, we all share a sense of finitude. And therefore, rather than projecting into the future, we can see ourselves as sharing the same fate of inevitable kind of decay. Today's event is called Changes, but I think the conclusion might be that the more things change, the more they stay the same. Thank you. I've got a few minutes for any questions, if there are any, or otherwise we can break and advance to the next panel.
Thank you. I wondered if you could say a little bit more about the shift from skin to flesh, so the why and the what is at stake, and also related to that, perhaps how this current moment of thinking about flesh has been coextensive with various forms of technology or network communications, how that is distinct or similar to earlier artistic reckonings of that relationship.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fundamental difference, and I'm probably being a bit simplistic, but for me, thinking about the skin is thinking really about barriers, and in that sense, it's really about encoding difference. Skin is about, in emphasizing skin, even if we acknowledge a sense of the messiness or the abject or the different, we're always distancing ourselves from it. We're emphasizing the tension between one and the other. Whereas the idea of the flesh underneath, the image of it is itself a kind of networked, undifferentiated form. We no longer need the barrier. We can think about how things might coexist. We lose that sense of a binary, perhaps. And this is thinking quite in a woolly way rather than a rigorous conceptual one. But yeah, that's the kind of, in terms of an image that I go to, I think of the flesh beneath the skin, in which many things can be interconnected without us noticing. Whereas emphasizing the skin is always about, as I say, this kind of barrier. And in terms of locating that in earlier, or relating that to thinkings in other times, I mean, I don't know, I've never really properly read cyborg theory, which I'm afraid to say I probably should have done. And I'm looking forward to hearing more about later. But I think, I mean, the skin, I think the idea of the skin as an envelope, which you find in thinkers like Didier Anzu, again, it's about a kind of wholeness, which I don't think is necessarily mutually exclusive from this ideas of coextensiveness, but I think it does privilege the idea of an individual subject, which again can be differentiated. And I think trying to think of subjectivity through and with and across the other, which we no longer see as other by being part flesh of our flesh, is maybe a different kind of challenge. That's sort of very general, but...
Any more questions? No? Then I would say thank you very much, Matthew.